Hour. And on behalf of the Office of Alumni Relations, my name is Gilbert Hernandez, and I'm the Senior Coordinator of the Alumni Relations Office. We're very excited to bring you this session today. I have with me, in collaboration with the Alumni Office, the Chair of the History Department, Laura Talamonte, as well as Professor Doris Lamala of the History Department, as well as 3 students from the History Club who will be assisting with the session today. Their names are Celia Quinones, Cesar Ovando, and Jonathan, I know Jonathan's last name. I saw it here a minute ago. But yes, they will be joining us to ask our guest, alumnus Daniel Martinez, who is a graduate from 83 in the area of history. And he is actually the chief historian at the Pearl Harbor National Memorial in Honolulu. And so we are thrilled to have him join us today. And we also have his professor with us, Emeritus Professor Don Hada, joining us as well, in addition to my colleagues, Director Felicia Hernandez of the Alumni Relations Office, as well as David Gambo, our External Relations AVP. So thank you very much, Dan, for joining us. I'm going to go ahead.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and start our PowerPoint slide with photos that you've given us. And I'll go ahead and let one of the History Club officers go ahead and take us right into the questions that they have for you regarding your experience.
Okay, great.
Whoever would like to start, either Cesar, Celia, Jonathan, take it away.
Okay, I'll begin.
Okay.
Okay, so you received your BA in history and your MA in public history from Dominguez Hills during the 1980s.
Right.
What were your career ideas and aspirations at the time? How did you go from a college history degree to becoming a national park ranger? And can you also talk about your path from a park ranger to a chief historian at Pearl Harbor National Memorial?
Sure. Let's start with the first. One of the things that when I began my undergraduate work, and I met Dr. Hata as my advisor, I had to find a job in the summer, and it wasn't going to be a teaching job, but I had a love for the national parks and especially historical parks. And I had, when I was younger, I had joined actually created a reenactment group of 7th Cavalry Horsemen. And we actually rode horses in Southern California. We had all the equipment and gear, super authentic to the 1870s. And in 1976, myself and Jerry Crandall, who was a young man from the LA area and a designer for McDonnell Douglas, we led these guys to the 100th anniversary of the Little Bighorn battle. And after that, I was asked if I would consider working as a park ranger during the summer, and I couldn't believe it. That was my dream. And so I applied, and there was over 85 applicants for 10 jobs, and I got it. And every summer through my undergrad and grad school, I was working at Little Bighorn. And that's how my Park Service career, because just in the latter years of my grad school work, I had an opportunity to get a permanent career. And at that time, the president was Ronald Reagan, and there was a hiring freeze, but there was 3 hardship parks that were available. And they were hardship parks because of the cost of living, and the areas where you had to live was going to be expensive. So they were the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island. They were Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and USS Arizona Memorial in Hawaii, on the island of Oahu. And since my family was at Pearl Harbor, I decided to go there. Now, the picture you see on the screen is my first year there. Uh, there's only two of us in this picture it was their first year. The man standing up against the post with his arms across his chest. We were new park rangers. And I'll never forget the first time I put that uniform on and understood what it meant. Fell in love with the ethics of the National Park Service. And I was sitting there on the porch of the original superintendent's house when in the late 1800s, 1890s, it was built, and that's where the superintendent actually lived. Later, I would be billeted on the second deck of that house, and I would be there for 7 seasons working as a park ranger. And at the end of that 7th season, I wanted to become a permanent employee in the Park Service. And I went to the hardship park, and I had the superintendent of the battlefield spoke for me to the superintendent at USS Arizona Memorial. And based on that, I was selected, and that began my career. I was seasonal for 1 more year. I was kind of like on a trial basis, and then I was selected for permanent employment. And I was 2 years later, I was the interpretive specialist for the park. That means that I monitored and created interpretive talks for the park rangers and monitored their talks. And then later, I applied with about 70 applicants for the park historian's position 2 years later. And I've been the park historian, chief historian later, because I had an employee work under me. And it's hard to believe it, but it started in 1989, and I've held that position to this day. And pinch me. Does that answer that question for you?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, it's something I'd recommend to history students, that the best way to understand history is to be at a site where you not only are immersed in it and live in it, but you're explaining it. And we have such great sites. And one of the sites I had wished to work at was at Manzanar. And years ago, when I was in school, I did one of my first papers, fairly extensive paper on Manzanar before it was even a national park, because my family on my mother's side lived up in Lone Pine, California, about 15 miles away from Manzanar. And I fell in love with the story. And in this sense, because there were so many human stories there, successes and tragedies that I was so unaware of. And my education, because of Don's guidance, had specialized in the area of history of Asians in America. And now I was open to new history and saw Manzanar in a whole different lens than I would have had I not had that education.
Okay, are we ready for our next question? Celia, do you want to ask him the number 2 question?
I can go.
Sure.
So as part of an assignment for your history class, for an oral history class, you conducted your interview with your grandfather about his experiences during and after Pearl Harbor. So can you talk a bit more about the experiences your grandfather went through?
Let me tell you, without Dominguez Hills, that wouldn't have taken place, because there was a coursework on the art of oral history. And so my first oral history project was interviewing my grandfather. And I had no idea what I was getting into. My grandfather did not want to talk about it. He got up and left the table at his home in Lone Pine with my grandmother, was sitting there, and he left the table 3 times, and you can hear it on the tape. And I didn't know why. When I got to Pearl Harbor and I started doing oral histories, I understood why, because he was reliving it.
Thank you.
And in doing that, he brought me to an emotional plateau of understanding that these veterans from time to time, or civilians that were eyewitnesses, were going to relive it, and they would react differently to questions that you would submit. And you had to be careful so that you wouldn't infringe on their privacy. And you could tell, I could tell when I was getting there, and I got there with my grandfather 3 times. He saw too much that day. Just recently, over at Pearl Harbor, there was a fire that was in one of the Navy, they're kind of huts that cover their special boats for the commanding officer at Pearl Harbor. It's actually the admiral's yacht. That fire broke loose there, and it burned the boats, and it burned partially the building. I found out later when I was talking to one of the historian architects at Pearl Harbor, he says, you know, Dan, that whole building was built on Aiea Pier. And I said, and then it flashed back to my grandfather's interview. He, after the attack, because he was a Navy federal worker, he was and a foreman, he had to get men together to get out on boats and to pick up the bodies that were floating in Aiea Bay, Pearl Harbor. And he laid them out, like he said, like cordwood for identification on that pier. And this just happened less than a year ago. And I can go and see that pier where my grandfather stood. And then I found out from one of the historians at Pearl Harbor, hey, Dan, you know, the train used to run by that pier and would stop there. And when they had those bodies there, over 100 of them, they brought down lumber from the train and they built the coffins there so that they could put them in those wooden coffins and take them to the burial site in Halava. It was a connection of history that started with my oral history of my grandfather. That's part of the collection now at Pearl Harbor. The National Park Service has that interview. And that was a Dominguez Hill project. The pictures you see are of the other thing. I was selected to be what they call at the National World War II Museum. There is a select group of people that were selected to be advisors for projects or for exhibits. And I got to go at least once a year back for a week to be part of a team to solve problems for or actually even promote maybe exhibits that we need to consider the visitor experience. And that's when I got to meet some of the man you see here. He just recently passed away. This was a Tuskegee Airman. His story is legend. And this is Colonel Charles McGee. And so this is the hotel that's very close to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And imagine just to sit right there on that couch and listen to some of the stories he would tell about the experience of a pilot. This doesn't happen without the education that I received at Dominguez Hills. It just wouldn't have happened. And over here, you'll see me in a picture off to the side with one of the, well, he became a soldier later. He was a young teenager when a senior in high school. That's Eva Field. It's the Marine Corps airfield just about a half-mile from his home. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they strafed the street by his home, and he saw the Japanese planes, and he went to the airfield with his father to help after the attack the next day. And there I am standing with a older man of Filipino ancestry, Filipino American, who comes there every year to honor the dead that were killed at that airfield at Eva. And here there I am in my uniform, and where else can something like this happen? I don't know. I've been so fortunate, and those are I have lots of these stories, and I suspect I should write about them. But yeah, that's part of what I do, and been privileged to do it.
Thank you for that, Dan. Celia, do you want to read the next question to Dan?
Yes. Can you talk about your work and research at the Pearl Harbor National Memorial, as well as events that you have been able to organize as your position of chief historian?
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry if I cut you off.
Well, to add on as well, like what is the most demanding and rewarding aspects of your position as well?
Well, that's a great question. I think the most demanding is finding enough time to get the job done. You don't do this job alone. I work for a superintendent, and I occasionally had a supervisor above me, and then I was a supervisor and had a park historian, staff historian with me. I think it's learning to work in the government is I think more bureaucratic than I had anticipated. Because in my earlier days, I didn't have all the responsibilities as an administrator would have. And so it was easy to see how my life fit as an independently in some ways as a park ranger. And then as becoming the historian, the disciplines and skills that I had learned over the years from Dominguez Hills and up through the Park Service, working with some great professionals, especially some of the historians from Washington, D.C., like Ed Bars and Dr. Harry Batowski. It was a learning curve, and learning that, not all your ideas are going to be as welcomed as you'd like them to be, that you're going to run into people that have a different perspective. And for me, the most important perspective as the superintendent, to make sure that the things that we do in the park fit the model of that administration and how he or she wants it to be. And so I've always thought that that's been difficult, because you have a vision of what you think it should be, but ultimately the superintendent is responsible, or your immediate supervisor is responsible for that path that you'll move through. Also, I found that in many cases, you can be an advocate for a program that you want, or research that needs to be done. You can do that. And I've been lucky enough to work for superintendents that have that kind of depth in understanding what the park needs could be and should be, and choosing the opportunity to get some of that done. Keeping in mind that I have been there since 1989. So in 1991, we had the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. We had over 6,000 Pearl Harbor survivors there in Honolulu and at Pearl Harbor when President Bush came and gave his famous speech, which was incredible. I have no rank in my heart speech, which was so needed because of the deep divisions that still existed between those from the United States that were there and from those in Japan. And I was happy to report that our site and myself and others were actively involved in moving towards reconciliation. And I've been so fortunate to have met and toured with presidents along with the superintendent. My first president that I actually met was George Bush Sr. I met him for like about 4 seconds and shook his hands as he came off the battleship Missouri for the 50th anniversary. I had a longer time with President Clinton and the First Lady when they came there for the closure of the 50th anniversary of World War II. And I think the most significant, Superintendent Jacqueline Ashwell and myself were on the Admiral's yacht with Carolyn Kennedy, who was ambassador for Japan, for the United States, and Prime Minister Abe and President Obama. For the first time, the Prime Minister had come with the President of the United States in a moment of reconciliation, and I was there and was able to speak to the President and Prime Minister Abe about President Kennedy's first effort of reconciliation just prior to the assassination in Dallas, which is kind of a bit of an unknown story, but I was saying it right in front of his daughter who didn't know that story. And that was a
Thank you, Dan.
that was a moment.
Do you
So
want to
here are
visit the
Here are
photos?
some of my
Yes.
friends up here. I just want to make sure, don't leave them out. And I had a passion to meet the Japanese American veterans, especially the ones here in Hawaii that enlisted while their families, some of them that were incarcerated. And in this case, these are the Americans of Japanese ancestry. These are 442nd fellas that I had met over the years. And the one that you see right there that's in the wheelchair, we have a picture of the 442 lined up before the palace in downtown Honolulu. And he came in there and he says, "That's me right there." That's a moment.
Thank you for that, Dan. I'll move over to the next slide and then we'll also ask the next question. Caesar, do you want to take that?
Yeah. Can you talk about the interment of ashes at the USS Arizona that the Pearl Harbor National Memorial observed in 2019 upon the passing of the last survivor of the 1941 attacks at the USS Arizona?
Sure. It goes back many years. I mean, it's been almost 20 years that I was involved with the interments. There was a Navy representative from Public Affairs named Jim Taylor, and Jim Taylor knew I had an interest in this, but he said, I would like to show you how we do these things. And so I went to the interment, and then because the Park Service is in charge of the USS Arizona Memorial, we're also partnered with the Navy as well. That's part of our operating agreement from the beginning since 1980, when the National Park Service started operations with the Navy at the visitor center there at Pearl Harbor. And at that time, he wanted me to understand how we did it, and we partnered, and he was the one that kind of led me through the process. And at this moment, the family members, the wife is behind and the son is behind, and the superintendent, Paul Dupre, is right next to me, right behind me, and I'm carrying the ashes for the family. And normally what you see in the next picture is another one. This is the only time where we actually had the grandchildren be there for the interment, because her father was too sick to come, who was a son of this Arizona survivor. And I have given the ashes to the admiral, and the admiral gives it to the family member, who in turn gives it to the diver. And then the ashes are brought over to the stern of the Arizona and placed in the turret well of number 4, which they go down the divers 30 feet and place them there. And inside the USS Arizona Memorial, superintendent that I had worked for, Kathy Billings, listened to one of my concerns, and then and not always I have the best sometimes of ideas, because I try to reach a lot, but I asked that, you know, we should make sure their names are here or they'll be forgotten. And she thought it was a good idea, but we didn't want to put them on the wall. So we put them on the outside, these cheeks of granite that are out there that protect the lights that shine up on the wall. We started listing the names of all of those that have been interred inside the USS Arizona. This is the only place in America where this takes place. And so now, today, there are only 2 survivors alive, and neither one of them will be interred. However, we will have an interment this year. Seaman Milhorn, who's I filled out the paperwork with me years ago, was found by his granddaughter, and they are now going to take his ashes and bring them this year to the memorial, perhaps on December 7th. And the last USS Arizona survivor will be placed in the ship. Well, the other part of my job, and this is not only just my job, but it's the job of all of the people I work with, we become friends with many of the Pearl Harbor survivors, and in particular, this case is the USS Arizona survivors. And oh boy, this is Lauren Bruner. And it's hard for me to get through these without tearing up because I know them. And I've known them for years. And so I know their families because they bring them there, their grandchildren. And Lauren is one of those. They're all special, but some of them are, you know, you kind of hang on to them a little tighter. And this was Lauren's interment. And so I MC that. And then I that is also co-shared with the Navy that have their remarks. The superintendent has their remarks, and there's a formal ceremony. And the ceremony is, if you've seen it on television or in some of the Discovery Channel type videos, is one of the most solemn and celebratory ceremonies that you could ever be a part of. And it usually takes place in the late afternoon of December 7th, and that's what you see here.
Thank you for that, Dan. Do we have the next question ready? Jonathan, do you want to take that up? Anyone? Celia or Susan, do you want to go ahead?
I think if anyone in the audience has questions, they can add them to the chat.
Oh, yeah, we're going to save that part for the end. I believe we have another question that you all had for Dan.
No, that's all the questions that we have.
That's all the questions? Okay, great. Felicia, would you like to help me read the questions from the chat?
Something that at this moment, I'd welcome everyone. If you do have any questions, I don't see any right now. So I welcome anyone in the audience who are participating. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We do have from Caitlin McAllister. Do you have, Daniel, do you have any advice for history students?
Well, I do. I think that don't enter the field unless you have a passion for it. You have to love this stuff. And in doing so, it energizes your professionalism. And I was very lucky to be surrounded by professors at Dominguez Hills that were models for that. And they didn't baby feed you, but they respected you. And if you did the work and asked the kind of questions that would broaden knowledge, there was always an environment for that. And I had thought of the professors for the life of me, there was a Mexican professor, and maybe Don Hata will, but I didn't know much about my ancestry. And I took 2 courses of the history of Mexico. And when I read the history of Mexico, it was not like anything that I had understood, because I had what many of us have, a very topical look at its history. And I always had a passion for the revolt in Texas, but my passion was probably more engendered by John Wayne's The Alamo than the actual event as it took place. And he was the one that said that this was not only part of a larger land grab, but it was also a fight over the position of whether Tejas would be a slave, holding. And certainly that was proved by the Civil War. So then you find out that these Texas heroes that you looked at were slave, like Jim Bowie was a slave trader and a slave owner. Travis had a slave in there. And it was shocking because I had the initial look as a kid of Davy Crockett. I grew up with that. And so when he's slamming down Mexicans at the end of the movie, I'm cheering. Well, not anymore. And that history is more delicate and more complex. And going to a place like you see this picture here of Auschwitz, confronting the reality of what happened there is gut-wrenching. And that's where you touch history and know where I'm standing. Thousands of lives were extinguished just a few moments after the passing of the train on that tracks at Auschwitz. So there is a reality to history as well. And you can see me in my uniform overlooking the USS Arizona Memorial with the battleship Arizona underneath it, but knowing that on December 7, 1941, 1,177 officers, sailors, and Marines, men of color and men from all over the country, were consumed by an explosion of flames that extinguished their lives. And so, as Professor Linenthal once said in his book, Sacred Ground, these are places that touch our souls and inflame our hearts.
Thank you for that, Dan. We have another question from the chat. What is
Yes.
one of your favorite memories of CSUDH?
I think my favorite, there's a lot of them, but there's some like personal ones and parties, and we're not going to get into that. And then there was the idea that we were connected. We are all in the experience. So I had a friend, you can't imagine this today, but a friend that worked in the library. And I was a student assistant, and I worked in the history office, and I mimeographed papers, Dr. Hata's papers, and brought them all her stuff. So I worked for, I forget her name, but she was like my second mom, and she treated me like one of her kids. So it was great. It worked out. And then I had someone that was over at the gym. So if I needed to study or do a paper, and remember, the computers we had were these green monograph things, and the green screens, and we could hardly get to one of those. So we were using IBM Selectric typewriters. And what was so cool about that is they had a way of erasing the type. And so that was good, because if you had Dr. Hata's class, you were only allowed, I think, 4 mistakes in punctuation and spelling. And so you really, really love that technology, which seems so funny today. But anyway, and then I could stay over the weekend and work, and I go over to the gym because I had a connection there where I could shower and clean up. I had a connection. We could work after hours in the library. So that would not happen today, but it did then. And I just then fell in love with the campus. And that was one of my memories. The other one was I was into this reenactment, and I did a impression for Dr. Judson Grenier of a Civil War soldier, and I fired a musket off, not live, but a blank round, and it brought all the security in the world around. And Judd and I, Dr. Grenier and I, almost got arrested. So it was quite a moment. So that's one of the memories, a funny one. But the other part of it was, the campus in those days was kind of spacious, and I had to take an elective, and you get to these lame electives, and there's one was theater appreciation, and I said, well, I'll take that one, and I took the elective, and I fell in love with theater because I ended up being a kind of an intern working with the lighting of this beautiful theater we had, and then I have a passion for film. And I think it engendered that. And I would have never had that experience had I not taken what I thought was going to be a lame elective on theater. And so those are some of my memories. And then another memory was driving, because I had been very successful in business before I went back to school. So I had a lot of money that I could pay for my apartment and stuff. And during that time, I purchased this. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that?
No, I don't think we can see it.
Oh, well, what it is my Porsche. And so this was my Porsche car at the time. And everybody thought I was kind of, snooty, I guess, because I had that car, but I had paid for it when I had been so successful in my business thing. And that was the car I went back and forth to school with. I can just tell you that particular experience of being a student on campus, and even a small one, and knowing a lot of people, and it was a community atmosphere. And the fact that we were invited when we were in our senior year or grad school years to go to the parties of some of the professors that would have, like Dr. Grenier and others, it was really neat to see them at that level.
Great, thank you for that, Dan. We have another question from the audience. What is your favorite part about your job and about studying history?
I think one of the favorite parts is writing. I finished a paper last night at about 5. Dr. Hatobi, no, it was, excuse me, I exaggerated. It was 4 a.m. when I finished it. I love to write, and once I get rolling, I don't want to stop. And so I was writing about the Honolulu Fire Department and their role on December 7th, which 3 of the firefighters were killed. 2 of them were fire chiefs, and one was the first Chinese American killed in World War II, Hosman Harry Pang. And the 2 fire chiefs were in their 50s, and they were due to retire a couple months after December. And they're now buried side by side at Oahu Cemetery. And I wrote that story. And I like researching. I have a passion for it. I recently found out by this new technology we have, you can have 300 newspapers you can look at. And I went in there, and no one knew what the first ceremony was like at the USS Arizona Memorial. And there was no memorial. It was actually a platform on the ship. And not only was I able to find out who was there, but what happened, and how this admiral had this passion to look forward to build a memorial there, but he built this platform first. And the role of Ralph Edwards and This Is Your Life, who kicked off the campaign to raise money to build a memorial. That these links of history towards memorialization go back in time. And as a historian, going back the footsteps, that I have now found something that I knew nothing about, and there's nothing been written about it. And I've now encapsulated the event of December 7th, the first year that Admiral Radford had the ceremony in 1950. And it was, there was a book called I forget the title. Don probably knows it, but it was that as a historian, you're a detective. And I've loved the idea of being a detective. And here in Hawaii, we're a smaller group of historians, a lot of people with different specialties, but we gravitate towards each other and share the information. And I have a friend that knows the Oahu Railroad backwards and forwards, and just a delight to talk about what the railroads were doing prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor and what did they do after. And so the Hawaiian history is so rich here. And so I have a passion for understanding the first people that were here. And then we had the immigrants come here, and that history is a passion of Chinese and Japanese and Korean and Filipinos who made their way to this island at the most humble means, and then worked so hard to make sure that their families would have the educations that they dreamed of. And that's still going on. And that's part of it. And then being at Pearl Harbor and meeting the different guests that come there and meeting the veterans in those early years is probably one of the most enriching things. And if you said, could I see this when I was at the university and going to coursework? And I'd say, yeah, I saw it. I didn't know how I was going to get there, but I was working in the summer at the national parks. And when I came back to the campus, I was there that I could actually share some of these and have the professors or even students, because we as students, especially in the graduate program, were not competitors. We were colleagues. And when you get to that, especially in the atmosphere that Dominguez Hills at that time, and I'm sure provides, a lot of us just didn't get up and leave the classroom. If we didn't have another class, we would carry on some of the discussions. And I think that the key to Dominguez Hills for me was the accessibility of the professors who genuinely cared. And I thought about this for a while in preparation. Why did they care? Because most of them had the vision that we were the future.
That's great, Dan. A couple other questions for you. This one is a two-part for you. Was there a specific moment that made you realize that you wanted to study history? A specific moment that struck a chord for you?
Yeah, it started early. I had on my mother's side, I had an aunt named, and she was Aunt Joe. I never knew while I was a young boy what her last name. She was just Aunt Joe. And Aunt Joe was she was a nurse, and she appreciated education. And when I was I think I was 6, and I was in Lone Pine, California, visiting my grandparents with my parents. And she said, would you like to go to the library? And I knew what a library was, but I hadn't been in one. I kind of knew what it was. And so I said, and she took me to a library. I believe it's a Carnegie library still. And she took me there, and I got a card. And, when you're 6 years old and you get a card, that means you can check out a book. And I remember the first book I checked out was a Landmark book, and Landmark made all these books on history, and it was on Custer's Last Stand. So I think I was a goner early. And so that was the moment when I had a passion to read, which I still have. And I never lost. Am I just a Pearl Harbor historian? Yeah, I love that. But I'm right now getting prepared to do a talk on the crossing of Washington. And in that found details of that incredible event, and got an idea of, I think I'm getting to understand how this Washington guy ticked. And it's the great story. I would recommend it to non-historians to read The Crossing, because everything was lost. The revolution was lost. Every battle that Washington had been in, he lost. And in that moment, he makes a decision to cross a river full of ice in boats and launch a surprise attack on Hessian troops, because that's all he's got left. So that little bit of thread of history allowed that spark of America to live through that winter of 1877. And without it, we're a British colony.
Wow, that's I never really knew that. It's information for me too.
Well,
Another
you would have
question?
heard that in my classrooms from my professors during that time. I'll tell you one thing. When Dr. Hatta lectured and Judson Grenier, you know how we're supposed to take notes? I couldn't do it. Their stories were too good. So I would just listen, and you felt you were there. And I remember Judd Grenier, he was talking about South Carolina and its aggressive politics and politicians that moved South Carolina towards, breaking away from the United States, that they were going to submit to no longer be a member, as we say. And he described this politician down to his facial geography, if for lack of a better word, and the fact that when he was uttering these rather despicable things about slavery and their rights to have slaves, that a little bit of moist slobber would move right off of his lips. Now, whether that happened or not, who knows? But it made that moment come alive. That this story of secession from the South and the breaking apart of the country and the wounds of that, he said, have not healed to this day. How appropriate to say that in the 1979, and that when here I am years later, and we're still dealing with that issue of race and also separation. And then I'll just say, since Dr. Hatta's here, he knows this, but I like people to know it. He made me understand the Japanese American experience. He and his wife, Nadine, God rest her soul, what a person she was. And when I went to Manzanar and walked among the ruins there, the place came alive. And I also had read a number of books on it. And then I found out that the National Park Service was going to acquire it. And so Manzanar, that I had been brought there since I was about 5 years old, because there were fruit trees there. And my grandparents would go out there to pick the fruit from the fruit trees that were planted by the internees there. And Manzanar became part of the experience. And every time I go to Lone Pine, I go to Manzanar. And my dad, who was like about 7, went over to the camp to see what was going on his bicycles with all these other Mexican American kids. And they got chased out by the guards, who kind of flashed their bayonets at them and to scare the kids. And they never went back. So it was part of our lives. And keeping in mind that my family was at Pearl Harbor, they end up in Lone Pine in 1945, because my grandfather is a miner and he's going to be mining in that area. And my parents meet in high school at Lone Pine. My dad's a pretty good athlete and my mom's a majorette, and they run off and get married later. And the town is shocked because the first interracial marriage has occurred. And then I come along and all is forgiven.
There you go, Dan. Thank you. Another question for you. What advice now would you give your student self then on academics and career?
Oh, I think that everybody's different. And I found out that people learn in different ways. How I absorb knowledge will may be different than how you do it. But I would say that when you're in that classroom, don't waste your time. that's a special moment, and it's only going to be a moment, part of the bridge of your career. Whatever you learn there, you take with you. The experiences and the friends you meet, you take with you. And Dominguez Hills, I often, when asked about it, I said it was the best private school in a public institution, that the education I got there, I couldn't have gotten at UCLA or USC, because I went to some of their programs, and in fact, they were fantastic, some of their seminars and symposia they had. But there wasn't that sense of community. And Dominguez Hills always had that. You could always feel comfortable on that campus, that you had an opportunity to meet people of color, of different backgrounds that you wouldn't. I went to Bishop Montgomery High School. There was one African-American in the school, and that was Earl Laster, my friend. And that was it. We were, you know, our parents, a lot of them, my dad was, worked for NASA Aerospace. We were my family of five, big, we were a middle class family and above that went to that school. And when I went to Dominguez Hills, that was a different reality. I met people of different ages, and I was an older student. I was in my late 20s when I was going back to school. And so I met a lot of different people of different backgrounds. And I wouldn't have had that if I had not gone to Dominguez Hills. And so they're encouraged. I remember the different cultural days we would have celebrating those cultures, whether it be Mexican American, African American, Japanese American, or Chinese American. And, it was the only campus, that struck me, the only campus that had a tea house and a Japanese shrine. And I said, wow, and I'm kind of into this. And then I find out that Dr. Hata and others were up behind that. And it set a standard at that campus that it was a broader place of understanding, and that the professors and students integrated a lot of their programs and teaching to enhance that experience. And so, yeah, it was different. And that was also, I remember, this is where I discovered Kurosawa. And I'm a huge fan, and that would have never happened. I had never seen a number of classic films until I went to Dominguez Hills that had a profound effect on interpretation of American culture. So, yeah, I think that it was a voyage of discovery. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you, Dan. I just want to let you know we're at the top of the hour now, and we've finished our questions. But I just want to know if you have any final words for our students that are here joining us.
Well, I hope that they'll come to Pearl Harbor and let me know they're coming. And the best way to do that is to probably contact you, and they can come and visit. I'd like to share that. Hope Don Hata will jump on an airplane and come out here, and I can share some of what I've learned over the years with him. And any of you, you're part of the Dominguez Hills family. And for me, I still have to come back. I mean, I'll be very frank with you. I'm I think 3 units short of finishing my MA. And so I've got my project, my design project is that project design is done. And Dr. Hata, I scanned along with some of my interns. We scanned all the records of every man killed on the USS Arizona. They're all their service records. It's over 91,000 pieces of documents. And so that will be my project. Hopefully that will be accepted. And I would look forward to finishing my MA.
Thank you, Dan. We look forward to that also. Do any of our faculty members that are joining us have any final words for the students?
besides
Dr.
help.
Hada?
Can you hear me?
I
Yes.
can hear you fine, sir.
Okay, so cut out the Dr. Hada from now on. You're not my student anymore.
Okay, well,
And let me say that you'll recognize this when a Marine drill instructor grudgingly commends anybody.
mhm,
They say outstanding.
yeah,
But you know the Japanese warrior guttural
mhm,
word. Sugoi.
yeah, do it.
Sugoi.
Yeah,
Good to see you.
it's good to see you, sir. Thank you.
If I could just say a thank you as the chair of the Department of History. What a pleasure to hear about your experiences and where they've taken you. And I think if I were a student right now, I would be so excited with the kinds of opportunities that you outlined from, following through step by step on certain things and letting yourself be challenged, even when it's really hard, right? It's hard to get those
Yeah.
people back with all that. Push yourself to do better. But I also just want to say that we have that same spirit. And so that was something we
Good.
talked about a few minutes before the event began. It's just really, really touching to hear that we've continued to be able to carry on that kind of community between professors, between students, with our staff, and to be connected to our alumni makes it even richer. So thank you so much.
Well, you should all be proud. You've been doing it for 40 years. So thank you. So, and I really want to thank you so much. Our Gilbert has done yeoman's work. Zoom is something that we rarely use before the pandemic. And it's magical to me and sometimes mysterious. But when you have people dedicated like Gilbert Hernandez, he makes these programs and work very carefully with me to get us to the point where I could discuss my career and my life at Dominguez Hills, which I'll always be thankful for.
Thank you for that, Dan. We're thankful that you were able to join us today and offer all this great information for us. And we will look into that trip to Hawaii to go see you.
Okay.
So,
It would not be proper if I did not say a very warm aloha to all.
Thank you.
thank you very much for that. Aloha to all as well. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This video will be available on our alumni website if you want to view it later on. But thank you for all your support. Thank you to the History Club, and thank you to the faculty of the History Department for helping us with this. And thank you, Don Hada, for joining us as well.
Yeah,
You all have a great evening.
thanks for bringing us together, Gilbert. Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Thanks,
Thank
Gilbert.
you. My
Bye.
pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.